They found the massacre at dawn. 47 rogue wolves lay dead in perfect circles. Not scattered. Not mauled. Arranged. Every single one had fallen to its knees, head bowed, throat exposed, a single clean strike to each jugular. Precise. Merciful. Surgical. The kind of kill that required something beyond training. Something that remembered the old ways, when death was still a courtesy you paid to the dying. At the center stood a girl. She was barefoot on mud black with blood that was not hers. Her dress was torn to rags. She was lean in the way only survivors are lean, not fragile, but forged. She had a rusted blade at her hip and 3 enormous wolves seated around her like a council. Not as pets. Not as weapons. As equals. She was humming. Commander Adiz said quietly from behind the king's right shoulder, "Sire." They died mid-bow. The girl turned. Her eyes were wrong. Not wolf wrong, not witch wrong, older. Dark irises with light layered inside them, like firelight trapped in deep water. She looked at the king across 47 bodies. She did not flinch. She did not run. She smiled. "You're late," she said. "I've been waiting for you for 300 years." The Lycan king, a man who had never knelt to anything living, felt his wolf go belly down inside his chest. And the waiting ended. Quick pause, comment where you're watching from, and if you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. I've got a lot more coming. Chapter 1. The king's name was Caius Nilsson, and he had ridden through 4 wars, 2 sieges, and 1 continent-wide plague without once feeling uncertain about what he was looking at. He was 34 years old and had been the most feared man alive for 11 of those years, and in all that time no battlefield, no council chamber, no enemy's face had made him question his read of a situation. He felt deeply uncertain now. 500 warriors stretched behind him in perfect formation, apex predators in dark plate, wolves living inside their blood that had never submitted to anything breathing. They had ridden south for 2 hard days through scorched farmland, past burned granaries and emptied villages, following the trail of a rogue wolf pack that had begun to take on the quality of myth. 47 rogues. A pack that had leveled 4 southern settlements in 6 weeks, that had killed 2 full military patrols sent to contain them, that should have required a battalion to bring down. A barefoot girl had done it alone. He did not dismount immediately. He sat his horse in the thin gray light of dawn and looked at what was arranged below him and thought, with the particular clarity that arrives just before something irrevocable, that he was looking at the most dangerous thing he had encountered in 34 years of living among dangerous things. It was not the dead. He had seen worse on battlefields and made worse himself. It was not the girl's 3 wolves, though they were enormous, ancient, probably, their coats carrying the dense gray of deep age, their eyes holding the specific intelligence that distinguished old wolves from young ones the way a scholar's gaze distinguished itself from a soldier's. It was the arrangement, the precision of it, the deliberate geometry of concentric circles, the way each wolf faced inward, the way each bore the same single wound, not a fighting wound, not a wound made in chaos, but a wound made with care. With intention. Someone had taken 47 dying animals and given them a dignified end. And then there was the humming. It came to him on the wind, formless, below the threshold of melody, more vibration than music. It moved through the cold air and arrived in his chest before his ears fully processed it, settling somewhere behind his sternum where his wolf lived. His wolf, which had been the constant companion of his consciousness since adolescence, restless, dominant, a low current of power that ran beneath everything he did, went absolutely still. That had never happened before. Not once. Not in battle, not in crisis, not in the worst moment of his life, which had been at 22 when he had held a siege for 90 days and watched his men break before the walls did. Through all of it, his wolf had been present, pressing, reliable as a second heartbeat. Now it simply stopped. And then, slowly, with the deliberateness of something enormous selecting its position very carefully, it lay down. Every wolf in his formation did the same. He heard it move through the column behind him, not a sound, exactly, but a quality of collective stillness, 500 internal wolves going horizontal all at once. His warriors would feel it the way he felt it, not as defeat, not as threat, but as something he did not have a word for. A recognition. As if 500 predators had simultaneously encountered something they had spent their entire lives oriented toward without knowing it. He kept his face still. He had spent a lifetime mastering that. "Adiz," he said. His commander of the eastern line brought her horse level with his right flank without a word. 11 years between them. She knew when he needed information and when he needed a moment to think, and she understood this was both. "The pack from Velith?" he asked. "Confirmed, sire." Her voice was professionally level, but he had been listening to her voice for 11 years, and he heard the current underneath it. She was rattled. Adiz rattled was rarer than clear skies over the Ashvin Range in winter. 3 rogue leaders identified by their markings. They're in the inner ring, arranged separately from the others. The lesser wolves form the outer circle. A pause. Like a court. He looked at the girl again. She had not moved. Not a step, not a shift in weight. She stood at the center of her arrangement of dead with the posture of someone who had made her peace with every possible outcome of this moment long before it arrived. There was a quality of patience in her stillness that made him think of very old things, siege walls, mountains, the kind of waiting that had passed through grief and come out the other side into something harder and more enduring than either. She had outlasted something. Many things. He could see it in the architecture of her, not her thinness, not her torn clothes, but the way she inhabited her own body, the economy of it. A structure built entirely around surviving. He dismounted. He stopped his guard with a raised hand before they could flank him and walked forward alone across the torn earth, between the outer ring of bodies, past wolves that had been placed with a care that defied every instinct of combat he had ever developed. The girl watched him come. She did not step back. She did not reach for the rusted blade at her hip. She watched him the way a person watches a fire they have tended through many cold nights, with ownership and exhaustion and the specific attentiveness of someone who has not yet permitted themselves to rest. He stopped 10 feet from her. She was younger than he had expected. Or no, that was wrong. That was the wrong read. She had the face of someone in their early 20s and the eyes of something that had stood in the same place while the world changed around it for centuries. The contradiction was sharp enough to make the back of his neck prickle, and Caius Nilsson did not prickle. "You killed them," he said. "I sent them," she said. Her voice was even. Precise. The voice of someone who had thought carefully about this distinction and found it important. There's a difference. Rogues don't choose the feral, they fall into it. Most of them can't find their way back. The merciful thing is a clean exit and a proper arrangement. She glanced at the outer ring with an expression he could not quite name. Old grief, worn smooth by handling. You wouldn't know about that. Your kind doesn't die that way. What way? Confused, she said. Lost in what they've become. He held the silence between them for a moment. Behind him, 500 warriors waited with the stillness of predators who had encountered something they could not categorize. Ahead of him, her 3 wolves watched with something warmer. The patience of creatures who had seen this particular conversation from the opposite side many times and found it, still, worth watching. "You said you've been waiting for me," he said. "For the 8th king," she said. "You're the 8th. I've been keeping count." Something shifted in her expression, not humor, not quite grief. Something older than either, residing below both. "Your bloodline breeds cautiously. It took longer than I expected. What do you want?" She reached slowly into the torn fabric at her side, not hiding the movement, not rushing it, and produced something small. A stone fragment, dark, veined with lines that seemed to shift in the gray morning light. She held it out on her open palm. "To show you what your ancestor took from mine," she said. "And to tell you the debt is 300 years past due." The fragment pulsed once. A resonance Caius felt not in his ears, but in the space behind his sternum, where his wolf was lying flat and silent. His wolf, for the first time in his life, made a sound he had never heard it make. Not threat, not submission. Something between a word and a breath, a sound he could not catch fully, as though it was spoken in a register his body could receive, but his mind could not yet hold. He stood in the cold gray dawn in the center of 47 arranged dead and looked at this barefoot, underfed woman with the ancient eyes and the pulsing stone, and felt the first crack form in the foundation of everything he had been told about himself. He said, quietly, "What is your name?" She closed her fingers around the stone. Her 3 wolves shifted small, synchronized, like a shared breath. "Mira-Ease," she said. "Last veil born of the southern line. And you are going to open the vault beneath your stronghold, Caius Nilsson, or I will find a way to open it that does not require your cooperation." The layered eyes held his without flinching, dark and amber, and something beneath both that had no name in any language he knew. "I have waited 300 years. I will not wait any longer, because you are afraid of what you will find." Behind him, 500 wolves were still. And the Leaken King felt something in him shift that was not his wolf and not his training and not the cold, something more essential than any of those things. The specific feeling of a man who has never been asked to question the ground beneath his feet and is now looking down and finding it less solid than he thought. He turned back toward his formation without giving her an answer. But he did not give her a denial either. And she was watching his back as he walked, and she was patient. She had learned patience the hard way, across centuries, and she could afford to wait 1 more hour. She had, after all, already waited 300 years. Chapter 2. He should have arrested her. That was what the law required. An unregistered woman commanding wild wolves in the borderlands, standing at the center of a kill site that defied military logic. The protocol was clear. Detain. Interrogate. Assess. Caius Nilsson had written 3 of the 6 border protocols himself. He knew every clause. He did not arrest her. Instead, he stood at the edge of the outer ring of arranged dead as his formation made camp around the site, and he looked at the stone fragment she had returned to her side, and he said, "Show me what it does." Commander Adiz, who had excellent hearing and the professional discipline never to reveal it, made a sound at the back of her throat that meant she was recording this moment for a future conversation she intended to have with him at considerable length. Mira-Ease studied him for a moment with those layered amber dark eyes. Then she opened her palm. The stone sang. That was the only word for it. A resonance below sound that moved through the earth, through the mud, through the boots of 500 warriors and into their chests simultaneously. Alive. Specific. The sound of something that had been trying to be heard for a very long time, finally given the range. Every wolf in the field, living and dead, lifted its head toward it. As if they knew it. As if the forgetting had always been the aberration. As if this was simply remembering. He had been near old things before. His stronghold sat on foundations that predated 3 civilizations. He had held artifacts from wars fought before his dynasty had a name. He understood the particular quality of deep age, the weight it carried, the silence that gathered around it, the way it pushed against the present moment like something reluctant to be contained in it. This was different in kind, not just degree. What the stone fragment carried was not the age of objects. It was the age of agreements. The age before written law and cartographic borders, before kingdoms and bloodlines were things with names. The age when the first covenants between species were made not on paper, but in breath and blood and intention, and when breaking them carried consequences that outlasted the people who had done the breaking. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. Mira held the fragment on her palm, and the resonance it emitted was felt rather than heard, a pulse in the sternum, in the back teeth, in the soles of his feet through the cold ground. The 3 wolves beside her had turned their massive heads toward it with the reverence of creatures approaching something that predated them and nonetheless belonged to them in some essential way. Behind him, he heard his formation respond, a collective adjustment, 500 wolves reorienting inside their hosts, drawn by something their human halves could only half perceive. "What is it?" he asked. "A piece of the binding stone." She held it steadily, palm flat, eyes on him. Her voice was precise, careful. The voice of someone who had rehearsed this explanation across decades and decided long ago to lead with evidence rather than emotion. "Your ancestor, Aldrich Nilsson, the first Leaken king, had it broken. The primary piece is sealed in the vault beneath your stronghold. This fragment was given to my grandmother as a message." A pause. She understood it as a mercy. "I understand it as evidence." Evidence of what? Of what was taken. She met his eyes without hesitation. The binding stone was the physical record of the original covenant between the Valeborn bloodline and the first wolf packs. A covenant of mutual partnership, wolves and Valeborn, freely bonded, neither owning the other. Freely given. Freely received. Aldrich Nilsson stole the stone 300 years ago and used it to perform a counter-ritual, the binding, which stripped the covenant of its mutuality and forced 300 Valeborn souls into Leaken bloodlines as bonded wolf spirits. Her eyes did not leave his. "That is what your wolf is. Not an evolution of your bloodline. Not a gift or a destiny. A stolen soul, held inside you without consent, generating power that was never meant to be yours." The silence that followed was absolute. He heard Adi's horse shift its weight. A hoof in mud. Nothing else. He was aware, with the particular clarity that comes at hinge points, that the next 30 seconds would determine the kind of man he would be for the rest of his life. He could respond with denial. The automatic defense of a dynasty's legitimacy was not a difficult argument to make, and he was experienced at making difficult arguments. He could respond with demands for verification, which was reasonable, which gave him time, which protected everything he had built his identity around. He thought about his wolf, belly flat and silent since the moment Mira had turned around. "You're telling me," he said, very quietly, "that every Leaken wolf on the continent is a person." 300 of them, she said. Souls fragmented across generations, their names and histories degrading as the bond degrades. In another century, they will be gone entirely. Not freed, erased. The way you erase something by keeping it so long it forgets what it was. He looked at the fragment in her palm. The lines moving through it, he had thought at first they were decorative. He understood now they were writing. A language he could not read, packed dense across the stone's surface. Names. Names were the most important thing any language was built to carry. How many names? He said. Something changed in her face. A crack in the careful precision, small, quickly controlled, but real. The first vulnerability he had seen. 300, she said. I know all of them. I have spent 3 centuries learning every one. Because someone had to remember. He stood in the gray morning light with 47 arranged dead around him and looked at this woman who had spent 300 years alone with 300 names that no one else was keeping, and felt something move through him that had nothing to do with his wolf. Something quieter. The weight of inherited guilt meeting truth for the first time. We ride north at first light, he said. You travel with the forward column. Your wolves travel free. He looked at her steadily. I am not making you a promise about the vault. I am giving you transport to my stronghold while I examine the archive records. What I find there will determine what comes next. She looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was not relief. She was too experienced in disappointment for relief. It was something more careful. The assessment of a woman who had been told things that turned out to be lies by 7 kings, measuring the specific weight of what this one had just said and deciding what to do with the fact that it was, so far, the most honest response she had received. If the archive records are complete, she said, you will find everything you need. A pause. Aldrich Nilsson documented what he did in detail. He was proud of it. He called it a necessary evolution. He wrote it down. She looked at him with those layered eyes. Your historians buried the documents, but they didn't destroy them. Destroying them would have required acknowledging they existed. He turned back to his formation without answering. He gave the order to make camp for the night. He assigned Mira a space at the camp's edge, near the tree line, where her wolves would have room. He told Adiz to see her provisioned. He went to his tent and sat alone in the lamplight and thought for a long time about a word he had read once in the oldest section of the dynastic archive. A word his historians had translated as wolf spirit and glossed over in 3 consecutive chapters of the official history. The word, he now understood, meant something closer to someone kept against their will. He sat with that for a long time. He did not sleep. She did not sleep. Caius knew because he didn't sleep either, and his tent was pitched close enough to the camp's eastern perimeter that he would have heard the quality of silence shift if it had. He had spent 34 years learning to read silence, what it meant in a military formation, what it meant in a negotiation, what it meant in the moment before a battle changed direction. The silence from the edge of camp was not the silence of sleep. It was the silence of someone keeping watch. He rose before dawn, as he did on every campaign night, a habit his generals called unnecessary sentiment and his instincts refused to release, and walked the perimeter himself. He rounded the eastern edge and found her exactly as he had half expected to, sitting cross-legged on bare ground, her 3 wolves arranged around her in a loose triangle, all 4 of them facing north. She did not look at him when he stopped. You should sleep, he said. So should you, she said. He stood in the cold dark with 500 sleeping warriors at his back and looked at the shape of a woman who had not slept in what he suspected was a very long time, and he thought that this was probably the strangest conversation he had ever had. And he had once negotiated a ceasefire while bleeding from 3 separate wounds. When did you last sleep properly? He asked. She considered this with the genuine seriousness of a tactical question. Define properly, she said. He sat down beside her without being invited. Not close enough space between them that it was clearly the choice of a man who understood boundaries and was not presuming on them, but near enough for conversation to be quiet. Her wolves assessed him briefly. The largest, a silver-gray animal with winter water eyes, held his gaze for a moment, then looked away. Not dismissal. Acceptance. The specific look of a creature who has decided someone is not a threat and filed them accordingly. He found this oddly settling. Tell me about them, he said. The wolves. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. He was learning that her silences were not empty. They were working silences, the pauses of someone who took language seriously enough to choose it carefully. The silver one is Kosi, she said at last. The dark ones are Ran and Amara. Kosi has been with me the longest, 140 years. She said this the way you said a number that should be remarkable but had ceased, through familiarity, to feel that way. They are not pets, she added. Not defensively. As clarification. They are not tools. They chose to come with me. Each of them. Chose, he said. Wild wolves choose, she said. They always have. The Veilborn understood that partnership required real choice, which required that both parties could decline. Kosi chose me when I was alone in the eastern forests after the fourth king's imprisonment, and I had lost. She stopped briefly. I had lost a great deal. She came and she sat with me, and she waited until I was ready to stand up again. Then she stood up with me. She looked at the wolf in question, who was watching the northern tree line with patient attention. Ran and Amara came later. When the mission changed shape and I needed speed more than I needed stillness. He thought about choosing. About whether any of the wolves in his formation, in his own chest, had ever had the real option to decline. Is that how it worked originally? He said. In the Covenant. A wolf chose a Veilborn and the Veilborn could refuse. Yes. She pulled her knees up slightly, adjusting to the cold. The original bond was genuinely mutual. A wolf would present itself to a Veilborn woman. The woman could accept or refuse. If she accepted, the bond was made through a simple ceremony, nothing complex, nothing requiring a stone or ritual. Just intention and consent. The wolf became a companion. A partner. Not a power source. Not a tool of war. She glanced at him sideways. Your ancestors looked at the Veilborn and saw something they wanted. They didn't want the partnership. They wanted the power the partnership generated, isolated from the element that made it ethical. The consent, he said. The consent, she confirmed. Strip out the consent, and you have a very effective weapon. You also have a crime. Your ancestor chose the weapon and called it destiny. He looked at the dark tree line for a moment. The cold was deep and steady, the kind that had settled in for the night and intended to stay until morning forced it out. The archive records from his reign, he said. You said he documented it. He was proud of it, she said flatly. He wrote to his war council in the months before the binding. He outlined the logic. He called the Veilborn women a natural resource being underutilized by their own sentimentality. He said the partnership model was inefficient, that the wolf's full power could not be accessed, while the bond required the wolf's cooperation. She paused. He was right about the power. He was catastrophically wrong about everything else. She looked at him. You will find those letters in the crates your historians marked as ceremonial records of limited practical relevance. I've seen that classification, he said. He did not say he had passed over those crates more than once. He suspected she already knew. Every version of the truth your dynasty buried was buried under that classification, she said. It was useful. No one throws away ceremonial records. It would seem disrespectful. But no one reads them either. They just accumulate in the deepest archive levels, waiting. Like you, he said. She turned and looked at him sharply. First, the look of someone who has heard something unexpected, and then the look changed. He couldn't name what replaced it. Something between acknowledgement and the beginning of something she hadn't permitted before. Yes, she said. Like me. They sat in silence for a while. The camp breathed around them, the slow, large breath of 500 sleeping warriors, the crackle of low fires, the occasional shift of horses on the picket line. The wolves stayed oriented north. Above them, the stars were sharp and dense in the winter sky, the kind of clarity that only came when the air was cold enough to strip it clean. What do you do with yourself? He said. In the in-between times. Between kings. She was quiet for a moment. I move, she said. I hunt rogues, the ones that need mercy killing, the ones who've gone feral and can't come back. I document. I maintain the names on the stone, not the binding stone, which I can't access, but the names as I carry them. She touched the fragment at her side briefly. And I wait. Waiting is the majority of what I have done for 300 years. She paused. I have become very good at it. I am less certain this is a virtue. What did you want to do? He asked. Before the mission. Before the 300 years. What did you want your life to be? She looked at him again, that sharp look, then the shift. He was beginning to understand that the sharpness was her first response to directness, and the shift was what came after, when she decided the question was genuine. I was a scholar, she said. My line were historians of the wolf packs. I wanted to write a complete history, every pack in the known world, their lineages, their migration patterns, the way their societies organized themselves. I had started it. She paused. I was 19 when the binding happened. I had 30 pages of notes. He looked at her. 19. She had been 19 when her world was taken. I'm sorry, he said. She looked at him steadily. Not with suspicion. She was past the point of suspecting his apology of being strategic. She was measuring whether it was real. Thank you, she said. Simply. The way someone says it when they have not had many occasions to say it and are not practiced in the receiving. Get some sleep, he said. We ride at dawn. You will need to be useful to yourself when we reach the stronghold. She almost smiled. Not quite. The suggestion of it, a slight shift at the corner of her mouth. When I reach the stronghold, she said, I will have no choice but to be useful to myself. I have come too far for anything else. He stood, brushed the cold ground from his clothes, and looked down at her, this woman who had been carrying 300 names and one unfinished history for 3 centuries, and said, The archive crates are in the supply wagons. I intend to read through the first half tomorrow night. If you know what to look for, it would be faster with 2. She looked up at him. You're asking for my help reading your own dynasty's records. I'm acknowledging you know them better than I do, he said. That's different. The almost smile moved fractionally closer to an actual one. Yes, she said. I'll help you. He walked back to his tent. He did not sleep, but the quality of his wakefulness changed. Something in him had settled, not into certainty, but into the kind of resolve that comes when a man stops arguing with himself about what is right and simply begins preparing to do it. Chapter 4. They read through the night. Mira sat across from him in the lamplight of his campaign tent with the first crate of archive documents between them, and he read and she read, and occasionally one of them said something and the other replied. And outside the tent the camp slept, and the wolves kept watch, and the cold deepened toward the dead of night. He had expected it to be worse. The act of reading, he meant of sitting across from the woman whose bloodline his ancestor had destroyed, and looking at documents that described the destruction in the perpetrator's own handwriting. He had expected it to be the kind of bad that shut you down, that made you go internal and defensive even when you had decided not to be. It was not that kind of bad. It was worse. It was the kind of bad that was entirely clear. That did not give you anywhere to hide because it did not require interpretation. Aldrich Nilsen had written plainly. He had written with the confidence of a man who expected history to agree with him, and so he had not bothered to shade his language toward justification. He had simply said what he had done and why, in the clean, direct sentences of someone who believed he was right. The believing he was right was perhaps the worst part. Mira read one passage aloud without commentary. Then she set the document down and looked at the lamp flame, and her expression was the expression of someone who has read the same words many times and still finds them newly terrible each time. He looked at her face and then at the document and then back at her face. "How many times have you read these?" he asked. "4," she said. "The second king showed me. The 5th. The 6th through a contact in his archive staff. And now," she paused. "It never gets easier. I have decided it should not." The letters were dated across 6 months of what his dynasty's official history called the Year of Consolidation, a phrase his court historians used to describe the period when Aldrich Nilsen unified the scattered Leakin territories under a single sovereign banner. The letters described something different. They described a campaign of deliberate targeting, small groups of veil-born women taken in the night, in winter, from the southern borderlands where they had lived for generations in the forests his historians described as uninhabited wilderness. The wilderness had not been uninhabited. It had been home. Aldrich wrote about the veil-born the way a commander writes about logistical challenges, with detachment and the specific frustration of someone who believes the obstacles in his path are less important than his destination. He had tried, he wrote, to negotiate with the southern bloodline first. He had offered terms. The Veilborn's leader, a woman named Osa, who appeared in 3 letters before disappearing from the record entirely, had refused. She had said that the wolf's power was not Aldrich's to claim, that the bond between Veilborn and wolf was not transferable, that what he wanted could not be done without the consent of both parties, and he would never have that consent. He had taken what he wanted anyway. The binding ritual itself was described in the 4th letter, methodically, in the tone of a man reporting a successful military operation. He had used the binding stone itself as the instrument, had forced it to accept a new covenant, one that did not require the Veilborn's agreement, one that transferred the bond to the Leakin bloodline without releasing the Veilborn's soul bonded to it. He had created, in his own words, a more efficient arrangement. The wolves retained their power. The Leakin bloodlines inherited it. The Veilborn souls became, as he put it, the spiritual infrastructure of a greater dynasty. Spiritual infrastructure. He set the letter down with great care. He was aware that if he moved too quickly, something in him might break in a direction he would not be able to recover from in a tent full of archived documents, and one very patient woman who had been carrying this for 300 years. He called them infrastructure, Caius said. Yes, Mira said. 300 women. Yes. He was quiet for a long time. Outside the tent, wind moved through the camp. One of Myra's wolves made a low sound, not distress. He had learned to distinguish distress from the other things they said. This was something else. Acknowledgement, perhaps. He knew what he was doing, Caius said. It was not a question. He needed to say it plainly, because there was a version of this history where Aldrich Nilsson was ignorant of the consequences, where the crime was thoughtlessness rather than intention, and that version was the more comfortable one. And Caius was no longer willing to reach for comfortable. He knew precisely what he was doing, Mira said. He simply believed it was justified. That a greater good, his dynasty, Leakin dominance, continental stability under his rule, made the cost acceptable. She paused. He was not stupid. He was not cruel for the sake of cruelty. He was something more specific and more dangerous than either of those things. He was a man who decided the people in his way were not fully people. Caius looked at the stack of documents remaining in the crate. The rest of these, he said. What do they contain? The years after the binding, she said. The beginning of the rewriting. How he changed the language, had the court scribes replace the covenant terminology with new vocabulary. Wolf spirit for bonded partner. Leakin gift for inherited bond. Natural dominance for what was actually a compelled transfer. She paused. Within 2 generations, the original terminology was gone from common use. Within 3, the Veilborn bloodline itself had been removed from the official histories. The forests were marked uninhabited. My people had been erased so thoroughly that most Lycans alive today have no idea we ever existed. You existed, he said. She looked at him. That's not adequate, he said. I know it isn't. But it's true. You existed and you exist. And what was done to your people was known and documented and deliberately obscured, which means it was understood to be wrong even by the people who did it, because you don't obscure things you're proud of. He looked at the letters in his hand. He was proud in private. He hid it in public. That distinction matters. It matters very little to 300 women waiting in the dark, she said. But the way she said it was not harsh, it was fair. The careful accuracy of someone who distinguished between what had moral weight and what had practical relevance. No, he said. It doesn't change what needs to be done. I know that. He set the letters down and looked at her across the lamplight. I'm going to open the vault. She went still. Not the careful stillness she maintained as armor, something different, something beneath that. The stillness of a person who has heard something they expected and also not expected, who has been told the same thing 7 times and received the opposite 6 of them, and who does not yet know which version of this is. You haven't read the rest of the documents, she said. Carefully. I don't need to, he said. I've read enough to know what the rest of them say. And I've read enough to know that there is no version of what's in those crates that changes what the right thing is. He paused. There will be consequences. Significant ones. My council will resist it. Other Leakin courts will react. My dynasty's legitimacy will be questioned, possibly violently. He looked at her steadily. None of that changes what is right. And I am tired of not doing the right thing because the right thing is inconvenient. He paused. I don't think I have been doing this consciously. I think I simply didn't look, which is its own kind of choosing. She was quiet for a long moment. The lamp flame moved between them. Her wolves outside the tent had gone still. I need you to understand, she said carefully, that I have heard this before. The 4th king said something similar. On the 3rd day of our first conversation, he looked at the documents and said he was going to open the vault and right the wrong. She paused. He had me imprisoned 2 days later. For 11 years. He held her gaze. I know, he said. I can't prove to you that I'm different by saying I'm different. I know that. A pause. So I won't ask you to believe me. I'll just do it. And you can believe what you see. She looked at him for a long time with those ancient layered eyes in the lamplight, measuring something he could not name. Then she said, We should sleep. We ride at dawn. He almost smiled. She was using his words back at him. We should, he agreed. She stood and gathered her half of the documents back into the crate with the careful reverence she applied to all of them, not precious with them, but respectful, the way you are with things that have endured. And she took them to the camp's edge, and she sat down with her wolves, and she did not sleep, and neither did he, but this time the wakefulness between them had a different quality. Something less solitary on both sides. Chapter 5. The stronghold appeared at noon on the third day. Black stone at the summit of a ridge, so sheer the road to it required 4 switchbacks, and the final approach was done in single file with the mountain on one side and the edge of the world on the other. Caius had ridden this road 400 times. He had stopped seeing it somewhere around the 100th. Now he saw it through different eyes, through the understanding that this place had been built on a specific act, with specific resources that were not the builders to use, and it looked different. Heavier. More deliberate in its dominance over the surrounding territory. He rode and did not speak. Beside him, Mira looked up at the stronghold once. Then she looked at him. The stone is 3 levels below the central keep, she said. Her hand moved briefly to her sternum and stopped, caught by something that functioned like discipline. I can feel it from here. It has been louder since dawn. He watched the stopped hand. Does it hurt? She considered this with genuine precision. It is like hearing your name spoken from very far away, she said. For 300 years. He said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say. He looked at the stronghold above them and rode. The court had been given 3 days' warning by the advance riders he'd sent from the second night's camp. Enough time to clear and prepare, not enough time to prepare arguments against him. He knew his court. He had built his court, in the way that a sovereign builds the people around themselves over 11 years of governance, not by selecting for agreement, but by selecting for intelligence and loyalty. The intelligence would produce the arguments. The loyalty, he hoped, would ultimately accept the outcome. High Counselor Renick met him in the main courtyard. Renick was 60 years old, gray, meticulous, and the finest institutional mind Caius had encountered in governance. He had served the previous king before serving Caius. He had, in 11 years, never once given Caius advice that was politically expedient at the expense of being correct. This was why Caius trusted him, and also why he had not warned him about Mira in advance, because Renick's advice, on this specific situation, would be correct from an institutional perspective and wrong from the perspective of justice. And Caius needed to act before Renick made the correct arguments. Renick looked at Mira with the expression of a man encountering something he has no file for. His eyes went to the wolves, then to the rusted blade at her hip, then to her eyes, and stayed there for a moment longer than was strictly professional. "Sire," he said, bringing his attention back to Caius. "The guest?" "Travels with full courtesy," Caius said. "She has quarters in the East Wing. Her wolves have free run of the grounds." He dismounted and handed his horse to the groom. "I need the archive crates, the full collection from Aldrich Nilsson's reign, brought to my study tonight. The ones classified as ceremonial records." A pause. "Sire." "All of them, Renick." Another pause, shorter. "Yes, sire." The voice of a man who was updating his threat assessment in real time and choosing, for now, to act before he argued. "The council meets at the 2nd hour tomorrow?" "The 3rd hour," Caius said. "I want the full night with the archive first." He looked at Renick steadily. "You'll hear everything at the council meeting. I won't act before then." I appreciate that, Rennick said, in the careful tone of someone who appreciated the form of a courtesy while suspecting the substance had already been decided. He was not wrong. Caius escorted Mira to the East Wing himself. She walked through the stronghold corridors with her wolves around her and her eyes moving across every surface with the specific attention of someone reading a place they know from description rather than experience. She looked at the foundation stones, the oldest sections, the ones that predated the current structure. She looked at the carved insignia above certain doors. She looked at the corridor that led down. The stairs to the lower levels are through the north wing, she said, as they turned into the east corridor. Yes, he said. I would like to go down tonight, she said. He looked at her. The council meets tomorrow morning. I told Rennick. I know what you told Rennick, she said. Evenly. Not impatience. She was too experienced with waiting for impatience. I am not asking to open the vault tonight. I am asking to go as far as the anteroom, to be in proximity to the stone. She looked at him with those layered eyes. I have been walking toward it for 300 years. I am not asking for the ritual. I am asking to stand near it for 1 hour. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, after the evening meal. Something in her face shifted, small, controlled, but real. Thank you, she said. He left her at the East Wing door and went to his study, where the first crate of archived documents was already waiting on the desk, and he sat down and opened it and read for 5 hours without stopping. And everything he read made him more certain and more sick simultaneously, which was the specific experience of understanding something you wish you could unknow but know you are better for knowing. At the evening meal, he sat at the head of the council table and Mira sat to his right, a placement that made Rennick's eyebrows perform a subtle and eloquent commentary. And she ate simply and sparingly and spoke when spoken to and otherwise watched the room with those reading eyes, cataloging everything, filing it, adding it to 300 years of accumulated observation. Lady Saren, his second counselor, asked Mira how she had come to be in the borderlands at the time of the rogue attack. Mira said, I was waiting for the king. Saren said, were you expecting the attack? Mira said, I was expecting him. The attack was incidental. Saren looked at Caius. Caius said nothing. Saren looked back at Mira with the expression of a woman recalibrating her assessment of a situation, which she did with considerable speed and very little visible disturbance. After the meal, he took her down to the anteroom outside the sub-basement staircase. She stood at the top of the stairs to the lower level with one hand on the wall and her eyes closed, and her wolves sat around her in their triangle, and the fragment at her hip pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm that he could feel at 5 feet of distance. She stood there for a long time, very still. Her face was undefended in a way he had not seen before, not because she had lowered her guard, but because the guard was not needed here. Whatever she was experiencing in proximity to the stone, it was not a threat. It was the closest thing to home she had. When she opened her eyes, he said, Tomorrow. Tomorrow, she said. She was entirely steady on the walk back to the East Wing. But when she reached her door and turned to him, he saw, very briefly, the look he would carry for a long time afterward, relief so large it had taken on the quality of grief, the way that very large feelings borrow each other's faces. I didn't know if I would make it here, she said. Quietly. The particular honesty of late evenings and stone corridors. I have thought about arriving here every day for 300 years, and I never let myself believe it until tonight. He said, You're here. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she went inside, and the door closed, and he stood in the corridor alone for a while with the weight of what was coming and what she had just said. And he thought that 300 years of not letting yourself believe in something was its own kind of damage that would take time and gentleness to heal, neither of which he had ever thought of as his particular strengths. He supposed he was going to learn. Chapter 6. Renick spoke for 40 minutes. It was, objectively, a thorough 40 minutes. He covered the dynastic charter, the archive classification protocols, the historical precedents for sovereign restriction on artifact access, the political implications of validating the claims of an unverified external party, and 3 separate legal arguments for why the vault should remain sealed pending a full independent historical review, a process he estimated, conservatively, at 2 to 4 years. Every argument was technically sound. Every argument was structurally correct. Not a single argument engaged with the documents now stacked in the center of the council table, which Caius had placed there before Renick began speaking, and which Renick had been very carefully not looking at since. When Renick finished, Caius picked up one document. The 3rd letter, written in Aldrich Nilsson's own handwriting, describing the logistics of the binding with the specificity of a military after-action report. He read it aloud. The whole of it. Without comment. The silence that followed was not political silence. It was not the silence of a debate pausing for strategy. It was the silence of 7 people who had just heard something that could not be unheard. Lady Saren's hands were flat on the table. Her eyes were on the document. Her wolf, Caius noticed, was pressed so hard against its internal boundaries that Saren's expression had fractured at the edges in a way he had never seen from her. The review, Saren said, quietly, will not take 2 years. He had not won before he began speaking. He had arrived at the council table understanding that 4 of 7 was the best likely outcome, that Renick would hold his position, and that holding his position was not disloyalty, it was what Renick was for. Institutions required people who protected their integrity against the impulsiveness of even good intentions. Renick was right to make the arguments. Caius was right to override them. Both things were true, and the process of the council was designed to hold both simultaneously. He explained what he had found in the archive across 2 hours of the most uncomfortable presentation he had given in 11 years of governance. He did not soften it. He did not frame it as open for debate. He presented it as what it was, evidence of a crime, documented by the perpetrator, buried by successive administrators who understood it to be damaging and chose convenience over conscience. Saren moved his position after the first letter. Lord Akin, 80 years old, veteran of 3 reigns, economy of expression elevated to high art, sat with his eyes closed for the entirety of the 2nd hour, and then opened them and said, with no preamble, "My wolf has a name. I don't know it. I have never known it. There are nights when something in my chest is grieving something I cannot identify or reach." He looked at the letter in the center of the table. "I want to know her name before I die. That seems like the minimum dignity I can offer." 2 more counselors moved. That was 4. Renick and Counselor Dane held the opposing position, methodically, without malice, on the grounds that the consequences of this action for dynastic stability and continental political relations needed more than overnight consideration. Caius did not disagree with the concern. He disagreed with the conclusion it produced. "The consequences are real," he said. "I've spent 3 nights thinking about them. The other Leakin courts will respond, some of them with alarm, some with denial, some, eventually, with violence. My dynasty's legitimacy will be challenged. Warriors in this formation and in the wider garrison will have complicated responses to understanding what their wolves are. He paused. None of that changes what is right. It only changes what is difficult. He looked around the table. I am not going to manage the difficulty by delaying the right. I've read what delay produces. It's in the crates. He let that sit for a moment. The vote is 4 in favor. I'm proceeding. The council is not being asked to authorize, you are being asked to witness and advise. Both doors remain open regardless of the vote. Renick said, the political fallout will be significant. I want that on record. On record, Caius said. Renick. I know. You're not wrong. He met the older man's eyes. I am asking you to trust that I've weighed it. That I'm choosing this clearly, not impulsively. Renick held his gaze for a long moment. The look of a man who has served 2 kings long enough to know the difference between recklessness and conviction, and who is updating his assessment of which this is. The sub-basement needs formal lighting arrangements, he said at last. If we're doing this, we do it correctly. The sub-basement will be lit tonight, Caius said. The vault will be opened in 3 days, after proper preparation, with the council present or not as each of you chooses. He left the council chamber and found Mira in the corridor outside. She had not been in the room. He had not asked her to be. She had her wolves, and she had the corridor's cold stone wall, and she had been waiting, which she was better at than anyone alive. 4, he said. Enough, she said. Renick will come around, he said. He's a good man. He protects the wrong thing with the right instincts. She looked at him for a moment. You're not angry with him. He's doing his job, Caius said. His job is to protect the institution. My job is to decide when the institution needs to change. He paused. We need each other for either to work. She looked at him, the reading look, the one that catalogued and filed. He had grown accustomed to it. He was beginning to understand it was not assessment of threat. It was something more like trying to understand what kind of person she was dealing with, because the kind of person mattered, and she had been given reason, across 3 centuries, to check carefully. The sub-basement is lit tonight, he said. Do you want to go down? She was very still for a moment. Then, yes. They went together, with torches and 2 trusted guards stationed at the upper staircase, and left there while Caius and Mira descended alone. 3 levels down, the corridor ended at an iron door, old enough that the metal had developed a surface that absorbed torchlight rather than reflecting it. There was no lock mechanism visible. The seal was not mechanical. It had been made the way all the original Nilsson seals were made, in blood and intention, renewed by each successive king who chose to leave it closed. He put his hand on the door. The iron was cold. Old. The seal activated at his touch a warmth, and then a current, and then from within the door a sound that was cousin to the resonance of the fragment, but darker, more confined. The voice of something that had been speaking into an empty room for 300 years. He held his hand there for a long moment. He felt the shape of it, the waiting, the confinement, 300 distinct presences like a cord held too long at the edge of resolution. He said, quietly, we will open this. Mira said nothing. But beside him she pressed her palm flat against the iron, and the fragment at her hip pulsed so strongly he could see the light of it through the fabric of her clothes, and from within the door the sound changed, the quality of it shifting, a fraction of a degree, from endurance into something that resembled, just slightly, the anticipation of being answered. Chapter 7. She began teaching him the language the first morning. Caius Nilsson, who had mastered military strategy at 15, was fluent in 6 modern languages by 20, and had negotiated 3 international treaties in his 30s. discovered that the original covenant language was unlike anything he had previously learned. It was not a language of grammar and syntax in the conventional sense. It was a language of intention, where each word carried not only meaning but weight, not only weight but consequence. To say a word incorrectly was not an error. It was a broken promise. Mira sat across from him in the anteroom with her wolves at the door, the fragment pulsing at her side. She said a word, slowly, with full attention. Then she said, again. He said the word again. She tilted her head. The second syllable. It carries intention, not breath. Say what you mean to do. He said the word again, with everything he meant behind it. The air between them shifted. Warmer. More present. The quality of a room where someone has just lit a fire. There, she said. And something in her eyes was warm, quickly passed, but real. The structure of the 3 preparation days was precise, detailed, and in a way he had not anticipated, intimate. Not in the incidental sense. Mira was constitutionally unsuited to intimacy of the kind that accumulates through proximity and small comforts exchanged without announcement. She was suited to a different kind, the intimacy of shared serious work, of 2 people doing something that mattered and finding, in that doing, the particular closeness that comes from having the same thing be real to both of you at the same time. He had known that kind of closeness in battle. He had not known it would feel like this. Language in the morning. She taught him the covenant vocabulary with the patience of someone who has been waiting to teach it to exactly this person, not impatient with his mistakes, not effusive at his progress, simply present and precise. She corrected him without condescension. She explained without over-explaining. She trusted him to learn, which he found was its own specific kind of regard. The ritual markings in the mid-morning. She applied them to his arms and the back of his neck with a pigment she produced from materials carried in the worn leather saddlebags she had brought from the borderlands. The pigment was dark, the smell of it old forests and stone, and something sweeter he couldn't identify. She worked with the focused attention of someone performing something sacred, not in a religious sense, but in the sense of a thing that deserved the full weight of the person doing it. He sat still under her hands and thought about the marks being words. Names. He was carrying names on his skin, 3 days before the undoing. It seemed right. Tell me about them, he said mid-second day, while she was working on his forearms. The 300. What do you know about who they were? She did not stop working. I know them from the stone, she said. The way memory inscribes to objects in the old practice. And from the fragment, which carries my grandmother's direct experience. A pause. They were mostly scholars. My line were historians. We kept the wolf lineages, the migration records, the social histories of every pack in the known world. Other Vale-born bloodlines had other specialties. The northern line were healers. The eastern line maintained the ritual knowledge. The western coastal line were the navigators. They traveled with the sea wolf packs along the coastal routes. Her tool rested briefly against his skin. They were entire people, with disagreements and preferences and things they loved and things they were bad at. She paused. The reduction of them to infrastructure. That is the specific crime. Not just the taking. The reduction. He thought about infrastructure. About how a word could do the work of erasure all by itself if chosen carefully enough. What was your grandmother's specialty, he said. Memory, she said. She was the bloodline's memory keeper. The one responsible for ensuring nothing was forgotten. A pause. She gave the stone fragment to my great-grandmother's wolf companion before the binding. Pushed it through the bars of where they were being held and said, "Keep this." so there will always be evidence. The tool moved again. The wolf carried it into the bond, passed it through 3 generations of Nilsson wolves, until it came to you. He thought about that. A fragment of stone passed through 3 centuries of Leaken bloodlines by a wolf trying to bring it home. He thought about his wolf, belly down since the borderlands, patient beyond any patience he had encountered in himself, carrying something across 34 years of his life that he had never known was there. She's been carrying it this whole time, he said. My wolf. Since before you were born, Mira said. Through your father. And his father. She paused. She wanted it to reach me. She has been trying to bring it home. He sat with this. The specific weight of it. A loyalty so long and so unacknowledged that it had become simply the shape of things, invisible through familiarity. The afternoon practice was the hardest. Stillness. She asked him to listen to his wolf without responding to it, without translating its communication into decisions and actions, without the constant loop of need and response that he had built around their coexistence over 34 years. Simply to be present to his wolf's experience as its own, separate, not about him. He was bad at this, initially. He was bad at it because he was experienced at control, and what she was asking was the opposite, not control of the wolf, but genuine presence to it. The way you are present to another person when you stop waiting for your turn to speak and actually listen. He spent the first afternoon sitting in the anteroom with his eyes closed, feeling his wolf's experience move through him and repeatedly catching himself translating it, filtering it, making it his. Each time, Mira said, quietly, let it be. By the 3rd afternoon he was doing it. He could hold his wolf's experience without absorbing it, could feel the separate consciousness of it, the specific texture of an entity that was not him, that had its own history and memory and grief that predated him by centuries. Your wolf taught you the last word, Mira said on the 3rd afternoon, watching him with something he was learning to recognize, the warmth she did not always catch before it showed. She did, he said. He had felt it, the word for the opening, the invitation, come not from his own memory of Myra's teaching, but from somewhere deeper, from the lived knowledge of someone who had spoken this language centuries before his birth. She knows the ritual, Mira said quietly. She has always known it. She has been waiting for someone who would listen long enough to learn it from her. He thought about 34 years of wolf wisdom he had been treating as instinct. He thought about how many things he might have understood sooner if he had been listening more carefully. I'm sorry, he said. He said it to the room, to the air between them, to the sealed vault 2 levels below, to the name his wolf had been speaking for 3 decades in a register he had never known how to receive. Mira went very still. She can hear you, she said. I know, he said. He said it again, in the covenant language, with the fullness of intention the language required. The air shifted. More present. Warmer. From somewhere below them, through stone and sealed iron and 300 years of waiting, something that felt like acknowledgement moved upward through the floor. On the 3rd evening, Mira said, Are you afraid? Yes, he said. Of feeling her go if she chooses to leave. Of the grief of it. He paused. And also afraid she won't want to. Which would mean something I don't know how to hold yet. He looked at her. Are you afraid? She was quiet for a moment. Of after, she said. I don't know who I am without the mission. I have never allowed myself to find out. She paused. I'm afraid it will be a smaller answer than the one I've been building toward. It won't be, he said. She looked at him. The person who has been doing the building, he said, is not small. The answer can't be smaller than the builder. He paused. It will be different. That's allowed. She looked at him for a long time in the cold anteroom light, and the warmth moved through her eyes without being caught this time, and she did not look away from it. He did not look away either. He held it. He was learning to hold things without managing them. Chapter 8. He found her on the battlements on the second preparation evening. She had been there long enough for cold to settle into her shoulders. She was looking north, toward the open mountain country where the Ashfin peaks cut the sky into dark shapes. Her wolves were scattered along the wall's edge, two lying flat, the silver one Kosi, standing at her left. He stood beside her without being invited. The wind at this altitude was sharp and tasted of ice and very old stone. She did not look at him when he arrived. She did not increase the space between them. He had been watching, across the days of preparation, the way she managed proximity, the subtle adjustments of someone who had not been near other people long enough to find it comfortable, but who was no longer moving away from him automatically. "You're not sleeping again," he said. "Neither are you." "I sleep 3 hours a night," he said. "I've slept 3 hours a night since I was 22. It's sufficient." "I sleep when I'm not watching something," she said. "I've been watching something for 300 years. He stood beside her on the battlements and thought about 3 centuries of vigilance and what it did to a person. He thought it probably did the same thing that 34 years of constant command had done to him, made the resting feel like falling. The mountains spread below them in the late evening dark, the valley lights of 3 towns visible at the base of the ridge, the deeper dark beyond where the southern road ran through farmland back toward the borderlands where they had met. 5 days ago. It felt longer. He had the sense that time around Mira moved differently, compressed in some registers, stretched in others, shaped by the weight of what she carried and what he had learned from it. "You've been quiet today," he said. "I'm always quiet," she said. "Differently quiet," he said. "There's a quality of quiet you have when something is working inside you. You're very still, but the stillness has current in it." He paused. "Today the stillness is just still." She looked at him then, the sharp look first, then the shift. He was fully familiar with both now. "You read people," she said. "I've had to," he said. 11 years of governance. You learn to read what isn't being said, or you make decisions on incomplete information. Do you read everyone this closely? He considered this honestly. "No," he said. "Most people I read strategically, for the information I need." A pause. "You I read because I want to understand." "That's different." She looked at him for a moment. "That's a more honest answer than I expected," she said. "I've been trying honesty," he said. It seemed like the applicable approach given the circumstances. Something in her expression did what it sometimes did, moved fractionally closer to warmth, caught between one quality of guard and another. "Renick came to me today," she said. "I assumed he would. He was careful about it," she said. "He didn't threaten. He presented the political case for delay, thoroughly, without malice. He said he understood the moral dimension and didn't dispute it. He said the question was timing and consequence management." She paused. "He's not wrong about the consequences." "No," Kaya said. "He isn't." 6 months, she said, before the other courts respond with something significant. That's his projection. "It's probably accurate," Kaya said. "More or less. And you're proceeding anyway." "Yes." He looked at the mountain. "Some things are not improved by being done carefully. They're only improved by being done." He paused. "We have been doing this carefully for 300 years. Carefully enough that the truth disappeared into classification folders and the people who were wronged were erased from history entirely. I don't think more careful is the answer." She was quiet. The silver wolf, Kosi, had moved down the wall and sat now at the edge of the space between them, not between them exactly, but behind both of them, its warm bulk facing outward into the cold dark. A presence at their backs. "I want to tell you something," she said. Her voice had changed, still precise, but with less of the careful management beneath it. "About the ritual. The undoing requires sustained physical contact between the veil-born conductor and the Leakin anchor. Throughout the ceremony. Not incidental contact, held contact. You'll need to remain physically present to me for the full duration." "I know," he said. "You described the mechanics." "I haven't," she stopped. Started again. "I am not practiced at sustained contact," she said. "I have been alone. 300 years is a long time to be alone, and the reflexes of solitude are very settled in me." She looked at the mountains. "I am telling you this because I am going to be managing it. During the ritual. Managing the contact as something to endure rather than being present to it. And I would like you to call that out if you see it happening. Because the ritual requires presence. It requires that I be actually in the moment rather than above it." He understood immediately what this had cost her to say. Not the content. He had understood the practical challenge. He understood what it cost a person who had survived by refusing to need anyone to look at the person nearest her and say, "I will need something from you. I don't fully know how to ask for it. Stay close enough to catch me." He said, "I will." Simply. Without making it large, because she would not want it large. She nodded. Something in her shoulders settled. Not relaxed, not quite, but the specific drop of someone who has braced for a reaction and found a different one and is quietly recalibrating around its absence. "After the ritual," she said, "after a while. When it's done. The stone is quiet and the 300 have their choice. What do you do next?" "Rebuild," he said. "There will be consequences to manage. The other courts. The warriors in my garrison who will react in various ways to understanding what their wolves are. New language to establish new protocols for the relationship between lichens and their wolf companions that actually reflect what the relationship is now." He paused. "There's a great deal of work. You don't dislike work." "I don't," he said. "It gives me shape. I'm better with something to do than without." He paused. "What about you?" After. She was quiet for a long time. "I have never let myself answer that," she said. It felt like hubris. To plan for an after when the thing itself might fail. 7 kings before you. Each one a potential after that didn't happen. She looked at the valley below. "I have 30 pages of notes on wolf histories from when I was 19. I have always thought that if there was an after, she stopped. I would finish the book." He looked at her. The vastness of what that meant, a project set down at 19, 300 years ago, when everything was taken, sitting in the 30 pages of a young scholar who had wanted a different life than the one she got. "You'll need access to records," he said. "The Nilsson Archive holds the most complete collection of wolf lineage documentation in the known world." He paused. "It was compiled largely from sources your bloodline created, which means it belongs to you as much as it belongs to us." Another pause. "The archive is here. You would have full access." She looked at him. He met her eyes and did not add anything to what he had said, because she was intelligent enough to understand what had been offered and did not need it explained. And he was experienced enough in negotiation to know that an offer made should be left space to be received. After a moment, she looked back at the mountains. "That's a very large offer," she said. "Yes," he said. "You're making it before you know how the ritual goes," she said. "Before you know who you are on the other side of it." "I know enough," he said, "about what I want the other side to look like." The wind moved between them. Kosi shifted, warm and patient, at their backs. In the valley below, one of the town lights went out and then another, the ordinary ending of ordinary days down in the world where the old stories had not yet arrived. They stayed until the stars were fully out, not talking much. The silence comfortable in a way that was entirely new between them, not the silence of careful management, not the silence of two people maintaining appropriate distance. The silence of two people who had said enough true things to each other that the space between words had stopped being a risk. He was aware, walking back through the stronghold alone, that the space between his ribs had changed in the last 5 days. Not emptier, fuller. Something had moved into the architecture of his thinking that had not been there before and that he did not want to be without. He recognized it, distantly, the way you recognize something you have read about but not experienced. He set it aside to think about after. For now, there was a vault to open and a ritual to perform and 300 years of waiting to finally end. Chapter 9. On the morning of the ritual, everything was very quiet. Adise came to him before dawn with bitter tea, as she had done on every significant morning of his campaign life, before battles, before negotiations, before the 3 times he had sent warriors into situations he was not certain they would survive. She handed him a cup without ceremony and sat across from him in his study in the chair she always used. She said, "Her name is Sarah." He looked at her. "My wolf," Adise said. Her face was entirely controlled. Her eyes were not. "Last night, she told me her name. And she told me she has been trying to say it for 40 years. Since before I was born, she was bonded to my mother's wolf first. My grandmother's before that." She set her cup down. 40 years of trying to say her name and not being heard. He was quiet. He let her have the silence. "She's not going to leave," Adise said. "When the choice comes." I asked her. Something crossed her face that he had not seen there before, a wonder so unexpected it sat strangely in her professional composure, like firelight in a sword's edge. She said she chose, originally, before the binding, and she still chooses. That the choice, freely made now, is different. Better. A pause. She wants to be called Sarah. Not the wolf. Not my wolf. Sarah. He said, "You'll call her Sarah." "Yes," said Adise. "I will." The vault room was prepared. Mira had been there since before dawn, he knew from the marks, the way they had been extended overnight from the previous day's work into a full ritual circle that covered most of the stone floor. The pigment glowed faintly in the torchlight. Not with magic, he thought. With intention. The physical residue of something prepared with total care over 3 days by a person who had been working toward this moment for 3 centuries. She was kneeling at the edge of the circle when he arrived. She was speaking quietly to the stone in the covenant language, in the low steady flow of someone making final preparations. He stopped inside the door and did not interrupt. Her wolves were not in the room. They were stationed at the vault entrance 2 levels up, unable to descend into the ritual space. He had heard them vocalize as she descended out of their range of sight, a sound with no word in any language he knew for it. The sound of love restrained by necessity. She finished. Stood. Turned. She looked different in a way he could not fully articulate. Same face, same posture, same economy of presence. But something had moved in her, the way a thing moves when it crosses a threshold it has been approaching for a very long time. She was on the other side of the anticipation now. She was in the fact of it. "The council is in the anteroom," he said. "Good," she said. "They should witness." She looked at him. "Are you ready?" He said the covenant word for yes, with everything he meant behind it. She heard the intention in it, and something in her face caught the light briefly, warm and unguarded and quick. "Come into the circle," she said. He crossed the floor and stood at the circle's center, facing the binding stone on its platform against the far wall. The stone was enormous at close range, the size of a millstone, dark, the names covering every surface in layers, the lines moving with a slow rise and fall of breath. He had felt it from the door on the night they'd first come down. At this distance, the resonance was not felt in the chest, but through it, through the chest, and into the spine, and down into the soles of his feet. 300 distinct presences, 300 individual qualities of waiting. Mira stood behind him and placed both palms flat between his shoulder blades. Her hands were warm. He had expected cold. She ran cool, as people who spent years outdoors in mountain country often did. But her hands against his back were warm in the way that matters, the warmth that is about the person rather than the temperature. "When I begin," she said quietly, "your wolf will come forward. Let her." "Yes." The second sequence will release the stone. You'll feel it as pressure or sound or something your body does with things too large for ordinary processing. "Yes." The third sequence is the invitation. The choice. Every bonded wolf on the continent will feel it through the bond network. The responses will come back through you, through the anchor, and you'll feel each one. A pause. 300 simultaneous decisions. It's very full. "And my wolves," he said. "Last," she said. "And clearest." Because it's personal. She said it not as technical information, but as something true that she was choosing to say plainly, and he understood in the saying of it that she was also telling him what this was to her, beyond the ritual mechanics. "Begin," he said. She began. The first sequence moved through him before his ears processed the sounds, his body receiving the intention of the words in the register below hearing, the one in the chest. His wolf came forward. Not aggressively. Not with the press of dominance that was her usual movement through his consciousness. Gently. With the deliberateness of something enormous that has been waiting to move for a very long time and is now, finally, permitted. He felt her clearly for the first time as her own self. Not his instinct. Not an extension of his will. A person ancient, patient, grieving, capable of joy, carrying 34 years of his life and 3 centuries before it, carrying the stone fragment through bloodlines and generations, carrying Myra's grandmother's gift across everything it had passed through. He felt her, and he let her be, exactly as Mira had taught him. The second sequence hit the stone, and the stone answered. The room filled with the resonance, not sound exactly, but what sound wants to be when it grows too large for air. He kept his feet. He had been prepared and still was barely prepared. 300 presences, all acknowledging simultaneously that something had changed, that the compulsion was lifting, that the choice was being approached. Then the third sequence rose. He felt it go out from Mira behind him like a tide, through his body and the stone and the floor and the mountain and outward across the continent, the invitation in the language of covenant. Choose. The full knowledge of what you are and what was done to you and what your options are. Both honored. Both right. The responses came back. All at once. All distinct. He had been told choir, and choir was accurate, but no choir he knew sounded like this. 300 voices with 300 personalities, some decisive, some deliberating, some carrying so much history the weight of them was almost physical. He felt women who had been bonded to kind people and chose, fully knowing, to stay in that kindness, the choosing itself a different experience from the compulsion it replaced, a conscious gift rather than an extraction. He felt women who chose to go not with anger, but with the specific relief of returning to themselves. He felt women who had simply been tired for so long that the release itself was the gift, regardless of where they were returning to. He held everyone. He did not lose a single voice. And then, last, his wolf came forward entirely. He felt the full weight of her, Kale, who had been a scholar, who had loved a wolf and been taken in winter, who had spent 300 years doing what she could from inside a bond she had not chosen. He felt her name the way you feel the answer to a question you've been asking your whole life without knowing it was a question. She made her choice. She chose to go. He had prepared for this and was inside the moment of it and found it different from the preparation in every way that mattered. He had expected loss. He experienced instead the specific grief of watching someone go home, the grief that is real but does not wish for a different outcome, the grief that says I will miss you and also you deserve this, and both are fully true. He let her go. He held the door open with everything the covenant language had given him, and he felt her cross it, and then she was gone, and the space where she had been was entirely his. His wolf, his actual wolf, the animal half of him, still present, still alive, raised its head in the silence and breathed a new breath. Mira exhaled behind him. Her hands were still on his back. Trembling now, not from weakness. He could feel the magnitude of what had moved through her, through both of them, through the continent. He turned, and she was standing with the amber in her eyes fully ascendant, and tears on her face that she was entirely unaware of, and the binding stone behind her was dark. Still, the names that had moved and breathed were motionless, released. He did not think about the right thing to do. He put his arms around her. She went still, the full-body stillness of someone who has not been held in a very long time, and then, very slowly, something in her gave. She leaned into it. Not collapsed, Mira-Ease did not collapse, but leaned with the specific weight of someone who has been standing alone so long they've forgotten what it is to have something at their back. He held on. He was good at holding on. She said all 300 names into the quiet of the vault room. One by one. He listened to everyone. When she was done, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "It's over." "It's over," he said. She did not move away immediately, and he did not move away, and neither of them addressed this. It was not a moment for address. It was a moment for simply being in it, the two of them and the dark quiet stone and the echo of 300 names finally spoken in a room that had held them too long. Chapter 10. The aftermath arrived in waves. The first wave was silence. For 3 hours after the ritual, the stronghold was quieter than Caius had ever heard it, a silence that moved through garrison and council chambers and kitchen corridors alike. Not the silence of shock, but of adjustment. He walked the corridors in the hour after they returned from the vault and found warriors sitting alone or in pairs in stairwells and halls, hands pressed to their chests, faces turned inward, some of them speaking quietly in voices not quite under their breath. Having first conversations with people who had been trying to speak to them for years. He found Adiz in the great hall, sitting alone at the far end of the council table, her hands folded in her lap. She looked up when he came in. She said, "Sarah keeps saying thank you." Her voice was entirely steady. Her eyes were not. He sat across from her. 40 years, Adiz said. She says the first thing she heard clearly was her name. When I said it the first time this morning, she said it was the loudest thing she had heard in 40 years. A pause. She wants to know if we can talk properly now. She says she has opinions about my tactical decisions. He almost smiled. Does she? Apparently, she has had opinions for 4 decades that she could never adequately communicate. Adiz paused. I have the sense this is going to be a significant adjustment in my working process. He told her the truth. He did not know yet. There was a specific quality to not knowing that was not distress, not the not knowing of uncertainty, which produced anxiety, but the not knowing of newness, which produced a kind of clean attention. He was very present. He was aware of the shape of himself in a way he had not been before the ritual. Lighter in the way that things that have been carrying something for a long time without knowing it are lighter when the weight is set down. Kale was gone. The grief of it was real, and he held it respectfully and did not try to minimize it. She had been part of him for 34 years, part of his bloodline for 3 centuries before that. Her absence was a real absence. He would learn its shape over time. What he noticed most, in the first hours after, was how entirely himself he was. How the instincts that moved through him now were his, without the 300-year history of another person's experience layered underneath. His wolf, curious and alive, was exploring their shared space with the tentative delight of an animal discovering new territory. He found this unexpectedly moving. The second wave of aftermath arrived by midday, the requests. 16 warriors came to him individually in the first 6 hours after the ritual. Their conversations were variations of the same conversation, the particular conversation of people who had just received information that reorganized their understanding of their own interior life and were trying to figure out what to do with it. Their wolves had names. Their wolves had histories. Their wolves had things to say. Each warrior was processing this in their own way, some with wonder, some with grief, some with a practical orientation that translated immediately into questions about what specifically changed in terms of how they were supposed to operate now. He answered all of them honestly. He told them what the ritual had done and what it had not done. The undoing had dissolved the compulsion and offered choice, but it had not dissolved the bonds themselves for those wolves who chose to stay. The bond simply had a different character now, chosen rather than compelled. The wolves were not employees or weapons or extensions of their hosts. They were partners, with voices, with preferences, with names. Renick found him in his study at the 3rd hour. He came alone, without the formal posture of council proceedings, and he sat across from Caius and was quiet for a moment before he said, "I owe you an apology." "You don't," Caius said. "I argued for delay," Renick said. "I understood the moral dimension, and I argued for delay on political grounds. That was the wrong priority ordering." "You did your job," Caius said. "Your job is to protect the institution. My job is to decide when the institution needs to be rebuilt rather than protected." He looked at the older man. "We need both of us. If I hadn't had your arguments, I might have moved too fast, without understanding the full weight of the consequences. You made me think harder." He paused. "That's what good counsel is." Renick was quiet for a moment. Then, "My wolf's name," he said. He said it the way Lord Akin had said it in the council, the specific weight of a man who had spent his professional life inside language and was encountering a word he had not had before. "He told me. An hour ago." A pause. "Merrick. His name is Merrick." He pressed his lips together briefly. "He said he has wanted to tell me for 60 years. He said he has spent 60 years watching me and trying to give me advice I could not hear." Another pause. "He has opinions about 2 of my treaty negotiations from the last decade. He says I missed something significant in both." Caius looked at him for a moment. "Do you think he's right?" Renick said, with the careful dignity of a very good counselor, "I think I need to re-examine my notes." The 3rd wave arrived in the late afternoon, carried by the Bond network across the continent. Across the known world, Leaken wolves were speaking. The undoing had reached them all. The choice had been offered to every bonded soul, and those souls who stayed were now speaking, and their speaking was moving through the bond connections between packs and bloodlines the way that water moves through a watershed, reaching further than any individual could reach alone. He went to find Mira. She was in the East Wing Library. He had sent someone to check, and when the East Wing Library came back as her location, he had known before he arrived exactly what he would find. She was surrounded by books. Not randomly, she had been moving through the shelves with a clear methodology, pulling volumes and stacking them in organized groups across 2 reading tables. Wolf lineage records, migration histories, territorial maps across 4 centuries. The archive's oldest materials on wolf pack social structures. And she was reading. Not analyzing strategically, not looking for evidence, not in service to the mission. Simply reading. With the specific posture of a scholar who has come home to the work they were born for. He stood in the library doorway and looked at her and felt something in his chest that he did not try to name but recognized. She looked up. "The archive is extraordinary," she said. Her voice was different. There was something in it he had not heard before. Something that was not performing a function. Something that was simply there because it wanted to be. There are lineage records here going back to the first packs. Aldrich's historians compiled extensively. They just kept the source attribution vague, so the Veilborn origins wouldn't surface. She held up a volume. "This is OSA's work. My grandmother's bloodline leader. The one who refused him." She said it with the equanimity of someone who has been grieving a person for a very long time and has come to a place with the grief where it coexists peacefully with everything else. Her writing is extraordinary. She had a framework for understanding wolf migration patterns that is more sophisticated than anything I've seen since. "You'll be the one to put her name back on it," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I will." He crossed the library and sat across from her at the reading table. In the space she had left clear of books, a coincidence, he thought, or perhaps not. He was learning to sit with coincidences rather than categorize them. "How are you?" he said. She thought about this with her customary precision. "Strange," she said. "The stone is quiet. I keep expecting to feel it, and then the silence where it was." She paused. "It's very loud, the absence of it. After 300 years." She set the volume down. "But it's the right kind of loud. Like when a sound you've been living with for so long you stopped hearing it finally stops, and the quiet itself is its own kind of answer. Does it feel like what you thought it would?" he said. She looked at the books around her. At the library, 300 years of wolf histories that were also 300 years of her bloodline's stolen work, waiting for someone to put the right names back on them. At the fragment at her side, now quiet, the lines on it still, the names no longer pulsing because the 300 were free. She put her hand over it for a moment. "Better," she said. "It feels better than I thought." He looked at her in the library of his stronghold with the wolf history spread around her and the aftermath of 300 years of waiting settling into something that resembled, distantly but unmistakably, the beginning of a future. "The offer stands," he said. "The archive. The access. As long as you want it." She looked at him. "As long as you want," he said. "I'm not putting conditions on it. I'm not asking for anything in return." He paused. "I am simply telling you that you are welcome here. That the work you came to do is not finished. The histories need to be rewritten. The names need to be restored. There is a great deal that has been erased that only you can recover." Another pause. "And that if you need a place to be while you do that work, this is a place." She looked at him for a long time. He did not rush her. He had learned that Mira-Ease arrived at things in her own time, and that the arriving was real when it came. "I have nowhere else to be," she said at last. Not sad, factual. And then, under the factual, something else. The beginning of an answer to the question of what she was when she was not the mission. She stopped. Started again. "I want to finish the book," she said. "The one I started at 19. I want to finish it properly." She looked at the volumes around her. "It's going to be a very long book." "I have a very large library," he said. The almost smile happened. He watched it cross from almost to actual, brief, real, the specific smile of a person who has not smiled with full commitment in a very long time and finds the muscles of it slightly unfamiliar. He did not tell her it was the most significant thing he had seen in the last 5 days, which it was. He simply received it. "All right," she said. Outside the library windows, the mountain country stretched away in the late afternoon light, the ridges and valleys of a continent that was, for the first time in 300 years, beginning to know the full truth of itself. In the stronghold around them, wolves and the people who carried them were having first real conversations. In the bond network beyond the walls, 300 voices were moving through the connections that had been built on compulsion and finding, in the choosing, something better than what they'd been forced into. It would take time. The rebuilding always took time. There would be courts that refused, and political consequences Rennick was already calculating, and individual warriors who grieved the loss of capacities they had not known were borrowed, and the slow, hard work of language changing and history being rewritten and names being put back where they belonged. But the stone was quiet. The 300 were free. And in the East Wing Library of the Nilsson Stronghold, the last Veilborn of the Southern Line opened a book that was also, in some sense, the book she had been trying to finish since she was 19 years old, and began. The Leaken King sat across from her and read wolf histories and did not leave, and she did not ask him to. That was enough. For now, that was everything.
If you enjoy watching this story, please like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.